We are here at the Royal Military Museum in Brussels to talk about the French Renault FT tank here, a revolutionary design from World War I. The Renault FT is considered as the first modern tank in the world. Why? It is essentially the first tank which featured a fully rotating armed turret which can turn 360 degrees in all directions. Secondly, this tank also has two tracks flanking the hull in which the crew resides. And it also has its engine in a separate compartment at the back. While in previous larger World War I tanks, the engine was together with the crew inside the vehicle, which is of course very inconvenient. The official name of this vehicle was the Char Léger Renault FT Model 1917. So light tank, Renault FT Model 1917. And this Model 1917 at the end is probably the reason why it is also incorrectly called the Renault FT 17. Now the FT in the name, often people think that it's an abbreviation of a French word, such as, for example, faible tonnage, lightweight, franchisseur des tranchées, crosser of trenches, or even force terrestre, a land army. But actually, the FT in the name is just the factory designation of Renault for this specific design of vehicle that they made. They always used a two-code designation for each of their designs. You also, for example, had the Renault AG, Taxi de la Marne truck, or even in World War II, the Renault UI, the small carrier vehicle. The roots of the Renault FT can be traced back to the ideas of the French General Estienne, the father of the French tank arm, who envisioned armored vehicles to support infantry. Renault finished the plans for the design as early as 1916, but due to bureaucratic delays, the tank was not produced and delivered to the troops before 1917. Since the initial surprise of the new tank weapon was lost after their first use by the British in 1916, General Estienne suspected that tanks would eventually be confronted with artillery. However, the big and thinly armored Schneider and Saint-Chamond tanks were no match for the German field guns, so Estienne argued for the B theory, small little tanks to swarm the enemy positions. 5 Renault FT tanks could be built for every heavy tank. They presented a smaller target and would be able to mass more firepower. The German response was to fortify their machine gun positions in concrete bunkers, which were a tougher nut to crack. The tanks had to advance to a close distance to fire into the bunkers, so German gunners aimed at their visors and often harmed the crew with spall, small metal fragments which could enter the tank. That's why the crew often wore protective chainmail masks like their British colleagues. However, much more FTs were getting lost due to getting stuck in anti-tank ditches, trenches or large shell holes than to enemy fire. The mechanical immaturity of the design also plagued the Renault FT. Many breakdowns occurred, especially the fan belt caused many problems right up until the end of the war. Their poor quality and handling by inexperienced drivers were a major issue. In one action, an American FT company used up more than one new fan belt per tank in less than a day. They could not sustain long operations due to getting mechanically exhausted, and their effective range was only about 35 kilometers. Lorries could not supply them during operations, so additional fuel had to be dragged with sleds towed by the tanks. To mechanically spare the vehicles, they were transported to their operations on trucks. While the Renault FT was often criticized for getting stuck due to its compact size, it also earned a reputation as a surprisingly capable mountain climber. One of the most remarkable demonstrations of its capability came from its American-built counterpart, the M1917, during a publicity stunt in April 1919. In an effort to boost war bond sales, a single M1917 tank was driven up Pikes Peak in the Rocky Mountains, then known as the world's highest motor drive. A few years later, the French carried out a similar feat, this time purely for sport. A Renault FT climbed the Col de Liseron in the French Alps, reaching an altitude of over 2,700 meters above sea level. The French Renault FTs were organized into tank battalions with 3 companies, 75 tanks in total. Each battalion had 30 gun tanks, 41 machine gun tanks and 4 radio tanks, but this composition proved hard to achieve due to delivery delays. Each company headquarters had a radio tank, 3 sections with 5 tanks, 3 gun and 2 machine gun tanks, a company workshop, a transport attachment and reserve tanks. However, this organization quickly fell apart due to the high loss rate of vehicles. The playing card markings indicated the section of the tank, while the geometric shape identified the company. The markings here indicate that the tank is from the Echelon or Reserve Section 2nd Company. During World War I, French tank crews typically wore a variation of the Adrian helmet, with the front brim removed. They were mostly dressed in the standard horizon blue wool uniform and the leather jacket. While Renault developed and produced the vehicle, because of the huge demand, they also had to find other firms to help produce the vehicle or to make parts for it. For example, many Renault FTs were also produced by Delaunay Belleville or by Somua by Schneider. Normally, the FT tank would have a small manufacturer's plate over here with the details of this specific vehicle, where it was produced on which date, but unfortunately it is missing here. We can find some other markings of other producers. For example, you have some BB on the track here, which stands for Boulogne-Billancourt producer. And also here on the idler reel, on the metal part of it, you have the R standing for Renault with the serial guide behind it. Also on the turret, you have the Giro indication over there. As you can see right here, this vehicle even has its original wooden idler wheels. So it's a large oak wheel with a steel rim at the sides. And essentially, Renault used these kinds of wooden wheels as part of the running gear. And of course, why wood? We were at wartime. Wood was more cheaper to produce than steel. And also the vehicle, it had to be under 7 tons, so they had to keep the weight down. And of course, wood weighs less than steel. The tank is also quite revolutionary in the fact that it featured a suspension, as you can see here. Of course, it has a suspension, which is quite revolutionary, but it does not mean that the tank actually had a smooth ride. It was not really the case. But the fact that the tank had this was already better than previous models, such as the Whippet over here, which did not have suspension. The Renault FT was originally designed as a machine gun tank, and that's why the original design by Renault featured a cast turret only for a machine gun, a Hotchkiss 8mm machine gun. But experience soon showed that the cast turret, it was way too small on the inside. It was very inconvenient. And that's why the French firm Berlier designed a new turret for the vehicle, and this is this one. It is an octagonal turret, so it has 8 sides, 8 angles, and it is called the omnibus turret. Why? Because they also wanted to equip the Renault FT with a Puteaux 37mm cannon, which is this one, and that's why they had to enlarge the turret. So this kind of turret, they could either house the machine gun version or the cannon inside. But there were also other firms looking for a way to improve the tank, and that's why another new turret was also developed. And that one can be found on the vehicle that we have here. This is a turret developed by Paul Giraud in Eugene. And there's also an omnibus turret, but this one is made from cast iron and not from riveted plating. So this one is round, fully round, a cast turret. And there were not much differences between the two. The riveted turret was a bit less prone to crackling metal from anti-tank rifles, but next to that they were very similar. And the Paul Giraud turret was much more applied to vehicles in later production, 1918. Here at the back of the vehicle, we can find this quite unusual device. This is actually a trench skid, so a small tail at the back of the vehicle, which would help it cross larger trenches. Of course, the Renault FT, it is quite a small vehicle, and it struggled crossing wider trenches, anti-tank ditches, large shell holes, and that's why the French also devised this apparatus at the back of the vehicle. The French not only use it on the Renault FTs, but they kept doing this practice also during the 30s on their more modern designs, such as the Hotchkiss and the Renault R35 tanks that were developed then. This trench skid is not originally of this vehicle because we find these two small holes here. And what do those mean? This trench kit was actually mounted on a Renault TSF tank. There were a few variants built of the Renault FT tank, and one of these was the Renault TSF, which means télégraphie sans fil, telephone without wire. And these were actually radio variants of the Renault FT. The original battle tanks didn't have radio, but they developed kind of command vehicles which featured a radio and a large casemate on top of the vehicle. And these were used to communicate with headquarters about the combat operations. And these also had a trench kit, but they had a lot more wire on top of them. And these two holes can tell us that this was originally mounted on a vehicle like that. The Renault FT was powered by a Renault four-cylinder air-cooled petrol engine, producing approximately 39 horsepower and giving it a top speed of 8 kilometers an hour. Its transmission featured 5 gears, 4 forward and 1 in reverse. Equipped with a 95-liter fuel tank, the tank had an operational range of about 60 kilometers. As you can see, our Renault FT is lacking an engine, so unfortunately, it won't be going anywhere anytime soon. Okay, now for the hardest part of the video, getting inside the tank. I will first open this one and open these hatches. As you can see, the interior is not in the best condition and there are a lot of parts missing. Now we're getting inside. At the both sides there are 2 foot pedals on which the crew could put their foot on to ease access to the vehicle. And here I am in the very primitive cockpit of the tank. There are a few controls here. I have some optical gear over here, small visors, very small vision slits to look outside, but there's really not only very small vision field. My controls, I have my pedals, my brake, my clutch. I can switch gears with this one over here. And here I have 2 of these gears, and they are meant to brake one of the 2 tracks. When I brake one of the track, of course, it turns that way. When I brake the other one, it goes like that. Very easy to use. An interesting fact is that in the driver's position on the left over here, you have the small metal bar attached to the vehicle. And this was made in the museum over here to hold a plexiglass to make sure that visitors didn't enter the tank. And here we have a small illustration from the Osprey book about French World War I tanks. And as you can see, the small metal bar is also on the image over here. So they studied this tank to make this image, and unfortunately also included the small, the small metal bar to hold the plexiglass. Here inside the tank, as you can see, there was a lot missing, the driver's seat as well. But as we enter, here used to be a lot of ammunition stowage. As you can see, the racks here on the sides. And above me is a 37mm pistol gun. Conditions inside the Renault FT were very primitive. But of course, there was a lot of sound of the chaos outside, of the machine, the guns, the cannon, the engine at the back. And it was very difficult for the tank commander in the turret to drive and give commands to the driver at the front. So they found new ways to give commands to the driver to indicate which way he had to go. For example, the tank commander in the turret, he would kick the driver on its right, on its left to make him take turns. Or he would do other things such as kick the driver in his back or at the back of his head to make him stop, or a bit harder to make him go forward. So they found new ways of communication to handle this annoying situation that they are in. Now to exit the tank. Et voilà! Pétain, commander-in-chief of the French army, had waited for a large force to assemble before throwing the tanks into battle. Besides more tanks, he also awaited the arrival of the Americans on the Western Front. However, the German spring offensive of 1918 disrupted these plans. The first unit into battle was the 501st Régiment d'Artillerie Spéciale, with 200 Renault tanks. They supported a counterattack against German troops advancing towards the Forêt de Ré on the approaches to Paris. Their tanks were deployed in small groups alongside Moroccan infantry at Ploisy-Chazelle, supporting their counterattack. The tanks advanced like cavalry, charging in a straight line formation through fields of wheat to engage the advancing German forces. Their sudden and determined assault wreaked havoc among the German infantry, machine gun crews, and light artillery units caught in their path. Out of the 30 tanks involved in the first initial counterattack, 2 were destroyed by enemy fire, 1 broke down, and 3 were overturned by the rough, uneven ground. They fought often in heavy forested areas where their small size and rotating turret proved useful. Larger vehicles would not be suited for this terrain. They also boosted the infantry's morale, although communication with the accompanying soldiers was very difficult. A problem that also later occurred was the lack of infantry to hold on to the gains of the vehicles. Not much tank infantry training had happened, since every tank was hoarded for combat use. In July 1918, they were used together with the French heavy tanks at Soissons, a battle after which the small vehicle became the primary tank in the French arsenal. After the war, several countries such as Belgium and Poland purchased the Renault FT or produced licensed copies such as the Fiat 3000 or the American M1917. The United States wished to use their own US-made light tank, the 6-ton tank model 1917 or M1917 licensed copy. However, since not enough were available, they initially received French FT tanks. George S. Patton played a pioneering role in American tank warfare by becoming the first officer assigned to the newly formed US Tank Corps. The commander of the Tank Training Center in the US was Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Eisenhower. The American FTs were used extensively in the long battle of the Meuse-Argonne Forest, which saw the largest use of Renault FTs in the conflict. On September 26, 1918, during the opening of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, George S. Patton advanced on foot alongside his tanks, braving enemy fire to rally demoralized infantry and direct the assault in person. Amid the chaos, he was wounded in the leg by machine gun fire, yet refused evacuation until his unit had secured their objective. For his extraordinary courage and leadership under fire, Patton was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The Renault FT 5 of Hearts was deployed by the US 344th Light Tank Battalion during this offensive on October 4, 1918. Supporting the 16th Infantry Regiment near Aix-Hermont, the tank advanced through intense German fire and sustained over 1,300 hits. Its driver was mortally wounded, the engine stalled, and the main gun malfunctioned. Yet its commander, Sergeant Arthur Snyder, continued to fight from inside using pistols and a damaged 37mm cannon. Despite their injuries, the crew held off the enemy attack until American infantry arrived to relieve them. Today, the 5 of Hearts is preserved at the National Museum of the United States Army. They often stayed in service until the 1930s, and many participated in the opening battles of World War II and even later. During the Battle for Poland in September 1939, Polish forces deployed a small number of Renault FT tanks to support the defense of Brest Fortress against the German 10th Panzer Division. On September 14, 12 Renault FT tanks helped repel an initial German tank assault, though all were eventually destroyed, damaged, or captured. Despite being obsolete, several FTs were positioned to block the North Gate tunnel of the fortress to prevent the German troops from entering. By 1940, France still maintained around 500 Renault FT tanks in active service, with many more stored in depots or deployed in the colonial territories. Although outdated by modern standards, the FT could still be effective in capable hands. One such example occurred during the German invasion of France in 1940, when Officer Cadet de Rouge used a single FT tank to halt a German column attempting to cross a bridge over the Marne River at Château-Thierry. The German troops, disguised in French equipment, attempted to deceive the defenders, but their ruse failed. Their force, comprising 2 armored cars, several trucks, infantry, and an anti-tank gun, was held at bay until the bridge was destroyed, thanks to de Rouge's determined defense. Following their victories across Europe, Germany captured hundreds of Renault FTs. Though obsolete for frontline combat, The Wehrmacht found various secondary roles for them in the occupied territories. FTs were employed for guarding military installations, conducting anti-partisan patrols, and serving in training roles. Many were transferred to the Luftwaffe, where they were used to guard airfields or as tractors to tow bombs. Others were integrated into the fortifications of the Atlantic Wall or repurposed as static defenses. After the fall of France in 1940, the German-backed Vichy regime was permitted to retain a small number of Renault FT tanks, some of which remained in colonial service. These aging vehicles saw unexpected combat during Operation Torch in November 1942, when American forces landed along the Moroccan coast. At the port of Safi, the 47th Regimental Combat Team came under attack from three Vichy-operated Renault FTs. When their bazooka shells failed, two of the tanks were disabled with rifle grenades, while a third crashed into a wall during a failed attempt to retreat. In a remarkable turn, an American sergeant climbed into one of the captured tanks and used his cannon to fire on the French defenders. Near the end of the war, Allied forces occasionally encountered old Renault FT tanks across Europe, some repurposed as static defenses, others surprisingly still in active German service. Notably, during the Battle for Paris in August 1944, a few Renault FTs were deployed by German forces in an improvised defensive role. Following the end of World War I, Belgium acquired approximately 50 Renault FT tanks between December 1919 and March 1920. These vehicles formed the core of the newly established Régiment de Chars de Combat, the Combat Tank Regiment, which was initially stationed in an abandoned German barracks at an airfield near Liège. Belgian crews received training from French instructors. The regiment was equipped with 26 FT tanks armed with cannon, 22 fitted with machine guns, and one TSF command tank equipped with a radio. All combat tanks featured the round cast turret typical of late production FTs. Although Belgium initially envisioned building a larger armored force, budgetary and logistical constraints limited the number of tanks acquired. Ultimately, the regiment was organized into a single battalion consisting of 3 companies of 8 tanks each, with an additional reserve company for training. In 1923, the unit relocated to a new base near Ghent, where training focused on supporting infantry operations. To enhance mobility, the regiment purchased 8 Chenar Walco trucks fitted with Belgian Minerva engines to transport the tanks. Belgian tank crews wore Alpine berets, featuring an insignia with a medieval helmet crossed by 2 cannon, as well as French-style tanker helmets and leather jackets. The tanks themselves carried playing card markings similar to those used by the French during World War I. Over the following years, the number of operational tanks gradually declined due to rare and mechanical issues. By 1931, only 14 Renault FTs remained serviceable. The tank's last significant deployment occurred during large-scale military exercises at Leopoldsburg in May 1934. By then, the aging FTs were considered obsolete and mechanically worn out. Belgian defense priorities had shifted towards static anti-tank defense strategies, rendering the tanks redundant. The tank regiment was officially disbanded in 1935. Nevertheless, the Renault FT saw a brief second life with the Belgian Gendarmerie police force. Following major labor strikes, the Gendarmerie sought tracked armored vehicles to clear barricades and maintain public order, but they lacked the funds for new equipment. The retired FTs were repurposed for this role and remained in use until 1938. During the mobilization of 1939-1940, the remaining tanks were again pressed into service, this time as makeshift tractors, to hold Quintet anti-tank barricades, also known as Belgian gates, into position around Antwerp. Unlike their French counterparts, the Belgian Renault FTs were not deployed in combat during the German invasion of 1940. Under German occupation, a few surviving FTs were used by the Luftwaffe to tow bomb-laden trailers on airfields. Unfortunately, none of the Belgian Renault FT tanks are known to have survived to the present day. While different Renault FTs survive to this day, this one has quite a unique story to tell us. It is a late war production, 1918. It was made by different subcontractors of Renault, which we can determine by the serial numbers that we found on the different pieces. But unfortunately, we don't know anything about its actual wartime service. So we don't know if it saw combat or not, by who. We have no idea about that. But then we wanted to investigate further if we could find any more trace of its history. And we came in touch with 2 researchers First, Pierre Clavel, a French researcher who was associated with the Saumur Tank Museum, and also Marius Zimny, a Polish specialist on Polish FTs. And with their help, we were able to uncover a bit more about the story of this specific vehicle. And you can see this object here, this L-shaped bracket pointing upwards. This was actually used to hold a specific type of headlight that you can only find on Polish FTs. Poland, after the war, they bought around 120 Renault FTs from France, making them the fourth largest armored force in the world at that time. So they also used the Polish FT during the interbellum years. And this used to hold a kind of headlight specific only to those kinds of Polish FTs. There are also some rivets, especially on the other side, which have a hole in them to connect the electrical wiring to this headlight. So a Polish FT, but what else were we able to find? Of course, we also crawled underneath the tank to see if we can find specific markings or a special kind of paint used. And we found something very weird over there, a hole. So there are two holes underneath the tank, one rectangular and one circular. And this also told us something very specific. This Renault FT has been used on a railroad cart as part of an armored train on a draisine. Poland in the 1930s, of course, their fleet of Renault FTs was getting obsolete, as in all the other countries as well. And they thought of maybe a new use to use these older aging tanks. And in Poland, we had a very bad road network, but the railroad train network was very good. So they thought of a new way to use these old tanks to protect their armored trains, which they had. And all of these armored trains that they developed, they were also all in combat during the German invasion of 1940. So how are these kind of vehicles used? They're used together with the Polish TKS tankettes, and they formed like independent small parts of an armored train. They could be integrated into a whole train or be used in separate small reconnaissance detachments. And they're mostly used in the combination of one Renault FT with two TKS tankettes. They could perform railroad reconnaissance, go ahead of the train. And the advantage was that while the tank itself normally could go only about 8 kilometers an hour, on this kind of railroad cart, which he could power with his own engine, he could go up to 50 kilometers an hour, which is really fast. So the Renault FT would just drive up to the railroad cart, connect to the railroad, the draisine drive shaft through the hole in its flooring, connect with it, and then it could be powered on its own. So we used together with the TKS tankettes. The TKS tankettes, they could more easily dismount the carriage and perform reconnaissance, while the Renault FT, slower, would stay behind and perform backup with its cannon, which the TKS did not have. So we know that it was used by the Polish. We don't know where they used it, if they perhaps used it in the war against the Soviets in the 1920s or not. We have no information about that, but we did know that they used it and that it was integrated into a railroad cart. But then what else? After the war, after the German invasion, of course, they captured a lot of Polish equipment. And what they did was they used, if it was in good condition, they sometimes refurbished it or use it as Beutepanzer. Mostly the older vehicles that they captured, they used them on second line service, not on the really front lines, but more in patrolling duties or security duties in the countries that they captured. And we think that this Polish Renault FT was also used like that. If you look on the inside, normally the flooring of the Renault FT is different. But the Germans, they made a new flooring on the tank to also cover the hole that was over there to connect the Renault FT to the drivetrain of the railroad cart. So they added a new flooring, they repainted the tank, and what else they did with it, we don't know. The story only picks up a few years later, in 1945, after the collapse of the German army, when this Polish FT was then found by American forces in the west of Germany at the Munsingen military camp. Here they found it with a lot of other captured German equipment, so other Beutepanzer, and it was collected at an assembly area for these kinds of vehicles. What you can also see is some unusual traces of former camouflage. We are not certain if it's perhaps a German camouflage, older or perhaps applied after the war. We only know that that this tank has received a large amount of painting coats. We think at least 7 or 8, so it's very hard to determine. We can see some green, some beige, some red, and some black lines as well. So very hard to say. So after the war, this tank was found by the Americans, brought back to the Munsingen camp collection area. And then that area where it was situated, it was handed over to the French occupying forces. So they each had their occupying areas in Germany, the occupation forces, and this one belonged to the French. The French, they, of course, they also collected all these vehicles assembled there, and they brought them during next years over to Satory, which was their ground where they analyzed all these kinds of vehicles to see what they could learn from them. This collection, assembled at Satory, would eventually form the basis of the current collection of the Saumur Tank Museum. And they were all moved there to Saumur in the 60s, 70s to make a new museum of armored vehicles over there, which is also very interesting to see with this one. After it was moved to Saumur around the 80s, the Saumur Museum was still at a different location in Saumur at the Manège de Bossu. And over there, when you entered the museum, you had a bust, a statue of Général Estienne, the père de char, the father of the tank. And this statue was flanked by 2 Renault FT tanks on both sides. The one that you can see on the right of the picture, it went to the Koblenz collection in Germany, the collection of the German army. And the left one eventually came to our museum here in Belgium. So this Renault FT tank, after it was in Saumur, in the 90s, the Belgian Army Museum organizes an exhibition to commemorate the 75th, yes, anniversary of the end of the war. And this one, was invited to participate in this collection, but eventually they arranged for an agreement to make it a permanent exhibition here in Belgium. And of course, we're very happy to have it here because we didn't have a Renault FT here at the time. And the Renault FT is also very symbolic for the Belgians because it's also the first tank in use by the new Belgian Tank Corps that was organized after World War I. So that's the story of the Renault FT, how it came to Belgium. In 2003, several rare Renault FT tanks were discovered by international coalition forces in Afghanistan. Afghanistan first acquired the Renault FT tanks during a period of military modernization in the 1920s and 1930s. At the time, the Afghan kingdom, lacking heavy weaponry, sought to bolster its armed forces by purchasing French-made Hotchkiss machine guns, 2 batteries of 105mm Schneider cannon, and 5 Renault FT tanks in 1928. However, some sources suggest that Afghanistan may have received an earlier shipment of 4 FT tanks as a gift from the Soviet Union in 1923. These tanks were reportedly captured from Polish forces during the 1920 Battle of Röne and subsequently transferred to Afghanistan, which was the first country to officially recognize the newly formed Soviet Union. The Renault FT tanks remained in use well into the 1950s before being retired from active service. Afterwards, they were used for training, museum display, or as gate guardians. It is rumored that the FT tanks were again being used during the Soviet-Afghan War, this time as static barricades and pillboxes. According to a Soviet officer in the 1980s, the Afghan army even possessed 1 Renault FT in operational condition. One tank on display in Kabul featured a very large gun barrel, which was later revealed to be an illusion created by slipping a piece of pipe over the original Puteaux 37mm cannon. Other Renault FT wrecks were found in various states of disrepair in scrapyards and abandoned vehicle parks around the city. Another FT was discovered in the possession of a local warlord living in an old British fort near Spinboldak, close to the border with Pakistan. This tank was eventually moved to the entrance of a joint French and American forward operating base. However, due to the base's remote location, the vehicle was never evacuated when the installation was later abandoned. The rediscovery of these historic armed vehicles sparked significant international interest. Ultimately, 2 of the tanks were transported to the United States aboard the US Air Force C-17 Globemaster III transport aircraft. One of them was restored and is now on display at the National Infantry Museum at Fort Moore, while the second remains unrestored at the US Army Armor and Cavalry Collection. A third tank was gifted to France and is currently part of the collection at the Musée des Blindés, the French Saumur Tank Museum. A fourth vehicle was transferred to Poland, where it was restored to operational condition and is now on display at the Polish Army Museum in Warsaw. Follow our channel if you are curious about which vehicle we'll discuss next, and to see me harm myself in even more creative ways. Bye!